Good, good. Do we should we wait for some of the folk to get in?
No. You're like, I'm gonna let you two go ahead and lead the conversation. I'm gonna stick around for a bit, and I'm just your willing student in this conversation.
Cool.
Yes,
How
sir.
many people do we have in right now?
I can go ahead and check the Twitch chat, but normally when we start, like we've got
Yeah, it takes a bit.
the countdown and we've got the intro music and all that, but because we're using a different streaming program, we're going to do all that tonight.
All right, so
So
we're, we're in.
yeah, we're in.
Cool. Bet. All right.
So wherever you want to start is completely up to you.
Okay. Well, let me first and foremost welcome everyone to the Rezistans Nwa Book Club. This is something that we'll be doing every week on Wednesday, preferably at 9:30. That's subject to change, of course. Um, the first book that we'll be engaging is going to be Discourse on Colonialism. We sort of, preface this entire book club conversation on Twitter by, putting on some notes, just dropping some ideas on there about the book itself. Ali, did you want to, introduce yourself or?
Yeah, what's going on, guys? My name's Ali. I don't really have much in the way of introductions, but I'm a student, and we're all students, so we're gonna try to advance ourselves here.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I definitely wanted to start with was, sort of like laying down some of the grounding methods that we'll be using throughout our book club conversations. And first and foremost, just want to speak to how, like, we don't see ourselves as like teachers of any sort, right? We don't see ourselves as instructors of any sort. What we
Mhm.
see ourselves is uh, a group of individuals who are engaging a text dialectically, engaging people through this process. And through pedagogy of the oppressed, he mentions in within the grounding method that we don't want to see ourselves as teachers where we become these all-knowing instructors and the people listening become sort of like these receptacles for which we just pour knowledge into. That is
Right.
not what this is. We're though we are also listeners, we are also students, and to even become, a teacher in a sense, you have to be a great student. So I definitely wanted to lead with that. Um, all right, so getting straight into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
It, yeah, getting straight into it. Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire. First, we want to sort of give a historic. We want to historicize the text, right? What we want to do is talk about the context in which this book emerged, right? So we're going to start with like a brief definition of what colonialism is, and though colonialism is broad, and there's different forms of colonialism. Specifically, we're talking about the colonialism in which this text was written, right? So
Right.
if you want to, Ali, you can sort of like give off like that definition that we had written down from earlier.
Right. I believe you posted this on Twitter earlier, but I'll share it again. Basically, colonialism is defined as the policy of coercion, land theft, socioeconomic exploitation, and savagery against non European people by the European ruling class. Colonialism abducts subjects of their culture, social relationships, and political institutions. Colonialism, in essence, turns subjects into objects of brute terror. Um, The process of partitioning Africa formally began with the Berlin Conference of 1884, but de facto colonialism predates this conference. In essence, 14 European powers agreed to divide Africa territorially among themselves, and their purpose was to make obsolete any forms of African and Arab Islamic slave trade. The purpose of the conference was to avoid armed conflict between the 14 European powers and effectively practice solidarity with each other. In short, though European nations had fought for centuries against one another over religion, economics, and territory, it was ultimately the colonizing of the third world in general, and Africa in particular, which merged these alliances.
Yeah. So as we see here, colonialism is a disruption of indigenous populations and how they construct their own political institutions, their own governing systems, their social relations, how they relate to one another, their kinship relations, and et cetera, et cetera. Right. So briefly going into Aimé Césaire himself before we delve into the book. Aimé Césaire was a poet, an intellectual, even a politician, right?
Yeah.
For Aimé Césaire is one of the spearheading leaders of the Negritude movement, which essentially was a movement of Black consciousness within the Francophone, around the Francophone intellectuals, which is basically the Black French intellectuals of their time. The Negro movement was Pan African, but it used Marxist theory. Uh, Much of the Negritude movement, pulls from the Surrealist movement of the 1920s, which is basically a response to the European powers after World War One. So, what you see in the Surrealist movement is sort of like this this art form that sort of like pushes the limits of consciousness in a sense, right? It sort of brings unconsciousness to the forefront, dreams in a sense, right? In the Surrealist movement, you get intellectuals, you get these artwork pieces that sort of stretch the imagination. At the time, it was seen as revolutionary. And like if you look at the work, they sort of use like they sort of use like strange creatures. They use like, for example, they'll use like a pot and a stove and sort of make that into like an animalistic looking figure, right? So they were
Right.
pushing the limits of the imagination, and they were doing, and many like communists during that time and many like anarchists were really under that umbrella of surrealism. So Aimé Césaire, he emerges, as one of the prime intellectuals, Black French intellectuals. He was a teacher of Frantz Fanon. And as you see in his work, he sort of anticipates much of Frantz Fanon's work.
Right.
Um, so that's just very brief. Just wanted to go into that. But here we are, discourse on colonialism. And again, this is just really going to be a discussion. It's not really going to be like a know-it-all type of thing. But we do want to sort of preface with all of those things first and foremost. So Ali, I mean, just going right into it, he holds no punches, right? Like
Right. No, he let the clip go on this one.
yeah, like he's holding absolutely no punches, and like he literally starts the text out just saying like a civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization.
Yeah.
A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a sick civilization. A civilization that plays fast and loose with its principles is a dying civilization. Like reading this text, like what are some of like your first thoughts, bro?
I mean, first and foremost, it's one of those things where it's very applicable in today's time. Like when you read it with everything going on, he keeps striking that nerve. And really, if I had to review this, it would be he does a very good job at striking that right nerve over and over and over, to the point where if you wanted to say, you could say he's repeating himself, but he's doing a really good job of repurposing, I guess, what he's trying to tell you. He's going to give you several examples. I think one of the most hard-hitting things, and I guess you and me talked about it, was I guess is this going to be out of order though? Because I was about to bring up the.
Oh, go wherever you want, bro. This is this is
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, what he's saying about the savages Hitler brought onto the Jewish population in Germany. It was okay before it happened in Europe,
absolutely
right?
yeah.
It wasn't one of those, like, it was. I remember recently I read that the French gassed Haitians. The severing of limbs.
Yeah.
Like these very horrific, very, very brutal tactics were used on non-Europeans, for centuries prior, and it becomes a tragedy on the world stage because the Western powers saw that if he could do it to Jewish people, he could do it to other European people.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was just it. It was one of those things where, for whatever reason, I've come across people who isolate the Holocaust from the rest of the plight of colonized people.
Yeah.
To the point where even, likening our people's struggle to their struggle, it's kind of seems taboo because there's this, uniqueness about it that media reinforces. But a true internationalist approach would be, we suffered the same, and the 6 million lost in the Holocaust. It was truly a tragedy.
Absolutely.
But there's tragedies that happened on the continent prior. There was tragedies that happened in Latin America prior. There's tragedies that happened in the Americas prior. And I mean, the tragedies continue to pile up even after World War II.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you bring up such a salient point, because in that text, man, he literally goes, he goes in and he specifically outlines how what happened to 6 million Jews was a tragedy, right? It was absolutely disastrous in epic proportions. But he questions, that's not out of the norm. The only thing that makes it out of the norm is that you're now doing it to European peoples, right?
Right.
Because beforehand, this had been done to the third world,
right.
throughout the diaspora. You get this all throughout the colonial world, right? Colonial subjects have been subjected to this terror. You read off earlier how colonialism, in essence, is having the subject turn into an object of brutal force, right? So this had gone on for centuries, but then it hit home, right? So we read. And I'll just briefly go over the passage that we're speaking on, because I think for listeners who haven't had the book, it would be good to mention. So he says, yes, it would be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism, and to reveal to the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeoisie of the 20th century that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside of him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, that if he rails against him, he is being inconsistent, and that at bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures, which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs in Algeria, the coolies of India, and the niggers of Africa.
Right.
So part of that, if we're being real, is an indictment of Europe, but it's also like an indictment of the humanist interpretation, right? So the humanist interpretation of how all of humanity has agency, right?
Right.
Aimé Césaire is he's sort of pushing back against that, because he feels like colonialism denies the humanity of colonized people, right? So we're not human within the Western sense of man. And in many ways, this anticipates the wretched of the earth that Fanon will write.
Yep.
In many ways, this anticipates Sylvia Wynter. So he's pushing back on that claim that humanity is some universal attribute, right?
Right.
So going a little bit deeper, I wrote a note about what Aimé Césaire is sort of responding to, in a sense. And one of the things I wrote down was Aimé Césaire argues against the mythos of the white man's burden, right? A claim which justifies colonial occupation, socioeconomic exploitation, and dehumanization under the pretext of civilizing the lower orders of the world. For me, there's always been this question of not always been not necessarily within our time frame, but the white man's burden, right? Part of this text is absolutely a response to the white man's burden, right?
Right.
And I believe me and you spoke. We had a conversation because there is an actual text of the or the contract or the litigation between the Berlin
Right.
Conference 1884,
Yeah.
which sort of like preface the white man's burden.
Yeah.
But what Aimé Césaire is pointing out here is that, just like he says in the beginning, like, you know, this is a decadent civilization, right?
Right.
And it actually seeks to decivilize the colonialists, right?
Right.
So
I
if
was
you could,
gonna.
yeah, go ahead, bro.
Yeah, I'm gonna rebound off that one.
Yeah.
So basically, you said the colonized subject is excluded from being human in the Western sense, and I mean, you can even talk about just in like the first couple paragraphs of the general agreement or the general act of the Berlin Conference. One of
Yeah.
the first like articles is the trade of all nations shall enjoy complete freedom. Um, Obviously he's not talking about the African the African lords and the African methods of production.
Right.
He's not talking about the Arabs, he's not talking about the Indians. So you can already see here that when they're agreeing to trade with each other, they're calling themselves the free nations of the world. Everything else is excluded.
Yep.
And to the point where I think even Sylvia Windsor building off of that, where it's these kinds of things where people make the claim that the colonized is not human. It's not that we're making that analysis up out of thin air. This is something that was actually practiced. And later on in the General Act, they're gonna they start off by saying the trade of all nations shall enjoy complete freedom, but then they go on to say any slave trading happening in the lands we're colonizing, this should be prohibited, right? Any movement of human property is prohibited.
Yeah.
By then, I think my time period could be a little bit messed up here, but by then I think they have accumulated enough to start industrializing further. I think even them saying we're not gonna fight each other while we're going on these expeditions for new territory, that just goes to show you that this is more of a safari where the colonizing natives are animals while the basically the Europeans are the huntsmen.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And on that latter point that you made, I actually made a note about that because, like, part of the argument is just pointing out the contradictions within Western man, right? So
Right.
I wrote that Caesar points out the contradiction of Western society by indicting its indefensible atrocities throughout the colonial world. On the one hand, Western man has proclaimed himself as the moral arc of the universe while maintaining that colonial subjects are savages. On the other hand, the rape, plunder, and pillaging of the colonized proves that the Western man is, in fact, the barbaric entity he projects onto his constructed others.
Right.
So part of that is just talking about how through colonization, the colonist himself is rapidly bringing on barbaric and savagery to the colonial subjects. Like, this process is one of savagery, right?
Right.
In itself, losing humanity while perpetuating such violence, right? And if
Right.
we can bring that to modern day, we can take that to contemporary day and age, where we see the violence of the state being enacted on the resistance movements since Breonna Taylor and George Floyd.
Right.
We see this barbaric, this savagery of the supposed free world, right?
Right.
This idea that America somehow has democracy and that democracy should be saved, or that democracy could be saved through the other political party,
Right.
the Democrats, right?
Right.
This is not. I mean, I fundamentally believe that this democracy cannot be saved, and it shouldn't be saved.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on Aimé Césaire? And because one of the things that he talks about is the relationship of, the colonized and the colonizer being one of like proletarianism, right?
Yeah.
Um, and how it's not limited to that, right? So it's not necessarily limited to forced labor, pressure, police taxation,
Right.
but it also has a racial component to it, like a racial
Right.
construction to it. So
Right.
he identifies that relationship as one that is predicated on race. So while he's engaging Marxist theory, he's engaging like a black Marxist theory,
Right. Part of that is because I think, like, Césaire, he doesn't really mince words. He'll, like, he applies the historical materialist, analysis, right? This isn't just him writing of his own free volition. Like, this is something he's seeing. Um, and something that he mentioned, I may be going off a little bit, but he said the European ruling class understands the threat of those who make a historical materialist analysis. They have been active against these disastrous prophets.
Mhm.
With Césaire, he's doing something, with, I guess, Marxism, with analyzing the working class relationship to their to the ruling class, to the point where he's saying, for the colonized person, the rules change a little bit, because there are factors that there are factors that the European proletariat simply just don't experience, right? Certain things aren't waged against them. Not saying that it could never happen,
Right.
but there are certain things that they don't get hit with that the colonized get hit with. And to the point where he's saying, like, to me, I read it as, it's not saying that Marxism is incompatible with with analyzing, like, the colonized subject. It's just that you have to be mindful, and you have to remember that colonialism is a deviation in history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with the Marxist analysis, it has to move in accordance with that. That's what I got out of it.
Yeah, and I'm sort of going through parts of the highlighted portions that I sort of like that were sort of succinct to me.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting here because he talks about how, for example, he says, I'm talking about natural economies that have been disrupted,
Right.
Harmonious and viable economies adapted to the indigenous population,
Right.
about food crops destroyed, malnutrition, permanently introduced agricultural development oriented solely towards the benefit of the metropolitan countries, about the looting of products, the looting of raw materials, right?
Right.
Uh, to me, this sort of speaks to it's talking about the subverting of indigenous economies, right? But it's
Right.
also talking about looting. It's talking about land theft. Uh, and what's interesting about that to me, if we're talking about like contemporary day and age, how you notice how like in the news media, how resistance movements are always mediatized as violent, right?
Right.
And the and the people who are resisting, not only are they said to be violent, but they're also said to be looters, right?
Right.
That they're stealing, right?
Right.
Um, and even when we talk about, I believe it was Minneapolis, where you saw the Target go up in flames, right?
Right.
There was this idea that somehow uh, Black people were really doing themselves in, because
Right.
they were, destroying a target that really, in no way reflects the
Not the interests, and not
right,
the
the interest in no way
right.
of the working class community of Black folk.
Right.
So to me, like, I'm wondering, like, how does, how, and if we can, sort of like talk about it, it don't even have to be extensively, but, just like, how does that work into what Aimé Césaire was talking about when he's talking about the economies, the looting, and how that's sort of like almost flipped on its head, and now it's the colonized fault, the
Right.
colonized
Right.
subject. Like, what the fuck?
Oh, man, it's just like, it's one of those things where, like, even back in the day, where the European man was burdening himself with you know, disciplining the rest of the world, you know, whipping them into shape and having them be in the hierarchy of, you know, the race relations that they were trying to promote and were enacting. The European man is always going to make himself look like the image of civilization, of law and order, of, you know, we're going to do things bureaucratically by the book. But it's, and I may be mincing words where I might get to the point where I'm rambling, but them flipping that burning target back onto the backs of the people who are suffering, to me that just reinforces, you know, the European, like white people, they're wedded to the American ideal, right? They're, when the underclass revolts, when the underclass burns something down, it's never a matter of what drove them to that, right? What drives a human being to burn something down? It's always a matter of these people just aren't getting, you know, they're not, they're beasts, they're savages, they're looters, they're killers, whatever the media narrative is. And that's historically been the case. I mean, you know, the United States government has a history of provocations against countries everywhere else. But when they're reporting it to you here, they're going to tell you that we're the arbiters of justice. You know, I even some American intelligence personnel will say that they're like the cops of the world. And that just goes to reinforcing, like, the language is going to be different. The language is always going to shift, but the main point will always be that the European man is the pinnacle of civilization, of order, of society staying intact, of actually having a society. And I guess my wording could be a little bit off, but that's what I picked up from it. It's that they're always going to make it look like the rebellions. I'm sure they didn't like the Haitians rebelling. I'm sure they tried to flip that a million ways back home, right? And really, that's what I got from it.
Yeah, I mean, bro, this text, man, 25 pages, but let me tell you, like, what's that joke? Like, what's that fucking meme on Twitter, bro? Where, like, you said, you actually said that that's how I was reading The Man Not, where every fucking page is just highlighted.
Right.
Bro, like, this is the one, bro. Like, cause like everything on here, like, speaks to like contemporary day and age.
Right.
It's so relevant to today.
Right.
It's like how are we, like, for example, like here he says, they talk to me about civilization, I talk about proletariatization and mystification. For my part, I make a systematic defense of the non-European civilizations. Every day that passes, every denial of justice, every beating by the police, every demand of the workers that is drowned in blood, every scandal that is hushed up, every punitive expedition, every police fan, every militiaman brings home to us the value of our old societies, right? They are communal societies, never societies of the many of the few, right?
Right.
They were societies that were not only anti-capitalist, as has been said, but also anti-capitalist, right?
Right.
To me, you know, that speaks to the broader sense of what we were talking about earlier when I sort of defined the Negritude movement, right? Because now he's conjuring up the indigenous civilizations, the African civilizations, in a Pan-African sense, right?
Right.
So he's talking about communalism, right?
Right.
He's talking about socialism as opposed to individualism, as opposed to capitalism,
Right.
And I mentioned this before, like, when you think about Black people and you relate it to how we've struggled, I think of like, for example, I've said this before. I think about how instead of being individualists, we've always been communal.
Right.
Instead of being, you know, even though we may not have always pronounced it socialism, it's been communal, as opposed to anti-capitalist, you know.
Right.
And even as how we've articulated freedom has been different from Western civilization, right? Because, I mean, Europeans have always articulated freedom around this idea of individual rights individual property rights,
Right.
property ownership. But for Black people, not only do we use the word freedom, but what we mean about freedom and what we've sort of like took up more so than talking about freedom is liberation, right? And when we talk about liberation, we talk about that in a communal sense. We talk about liberation of all people, right? So even when we get in the United States, when you get the song like the Black National Anthem, you have lift every voice and sing, right? So like, how do Black people, know to say lift every voice when much of our voices have been silenced since the beginning of time, right?
Right.
That's that liberatory struggle that we've sort of formed alliances around within Africa diaspora. So everything about, the conditions that sort of like produce our worldview,
Right.
leans towards liberation for everyone. It's that intercommunalism, it's that internationalism, and so like for Césaire and his Negritude movement, to bring it back to the Negritude movement, that is in many ways that's where we get in the United States the Black is beautiful uh saying. Many may not know that, but like that's where a lot of that came from, because the Negritude movement was like in the 1930s, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then as it sort of like is galvanizing individuals to see Blackness as beautiful, and it sort of subverts the word of negra, I believe, because I believe negra had like a very negative connotation.
Yeah.
And it flips the script there, because Negritude movement was also a literary theory that critiqued much of the literary theories that preceded it. So it turns that negra word, subverts it and makes it a beautiful thing, and I think that's what not only the Negritude movement does, but that's what Pan Africanism does writ large. So
I mean, okay. So speaking about Pan Africanism, like that's a good point. One of the things, like reading this, I don't know how like topical we're gonna be as far as modern, like current issues, but a lot of what I heard about Europeans from so-called, like, I guess, Black reactionaries, I'm using that word very loosely, like the Hoteps, like what people are calling the Hoteps, the any number of the factions there are, where they speak of Europeans as, where they flip it back on them and say, we're not the savages, you are.
Yeah,
I've heard that from many people, but like hearing M. Césaire say it, I'm like, okay, well, Khalid Muhammad just wasn't being hyperbolic in the situation.
Hey,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, like, I could easily like see putting this in the hands of like a close friend of mine, or anybody who is questioning what the current order is. I feel like it may be a bit wordy, but it's very, very accessible. If you just sit down with it, it's like an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours if you're a slow reader. But this was a solid, like, just 20 pages of work. Yeah. And I mean, him saying he ended it with, the bourgeois European is the modern barbarian.
Yeah.
Like, that's so poignant.
It is. It definitely is.
He even no, you're good. He keeps like he has so many one-liners, bro. He has like another one where all the old tyrants get along swimmingly with the new tyrants, right? Where he mentions, don't talk to me about what's going on before colonialism. The evils of, the old world and the new world are linking together, right? And they become this much worse thing.
Right.
And even that's like, that could be used as a preface for understanding, police infiltration, the United States military carrying out covert operations overseas where they, where they're in bed with terrorists that they're telling us they're fighting.
Yeah.
This is one of those things where he is prophetic. He's, when he mentions the European ruling class is active against the disastrous prophets. I mean, I think he's talking about himself.
No, yeah, I mean that's poignant. His most infamous one liner in here, I can't even find it, but when he says my turn to he says something like my turn to name an equation, colonization equals thingification, right?
Yeah.
That's big. That's a big thing, right? Like that's, I mean,
Okay, so break it down for me if I don't know what that is.
so for me when he says, so even in the beginning, right, we mentioned how colonization in turn, or in essence, uh turns the subject into an object of brute force, right? Um, and I mean, I'm a, I may go a little deep if I have the time. Think about, so for me, it turns into the turning something into an object, or thingification is basically denying its volition, its humanity, its
Right.
agency.
Right.
Um, and in turn, not only are you denying that, but you're diluting the culture, but you're also presenting and you're overwhelming colonial subjects with the consciousness not of their own,
Right.
but of the colonial power.
Right.
And so Caesar touches on this, right?
And I guess that could, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that could, link with the idea of like ruling class hegemony or
Absolutely,
hegemony,
absolutely,
where the hegemonic narrative is the ruling class narrative.
absolutely.
Right.
And in that, I mean, and it's crazy because he again, he's anticipating Fanon. And if you read Black Skin White Mask, I
Yeah.
believe it's the fifth chapter, which is the fact of blackness, which is actually a mistranslation. Many scholars agree that the real translation of that chapter is the lived experience of blackness. So what Fanon is doing in that chapter, and this all goes into what Caesar is speaking to, is like the consciousness, right?
Right.
He's in that chapter. He's talking about he's relating to the first person and the third person, right?
Right.
Um, the first person being the consciousness of the individual, but that third person, uh, not being a not being an objective consciousness, but the consciousness of the onlooker, which is the Western man.
Right.
So we end up perceiving ourselves through the eyes of the Western man. I
Right.
mean, literally, this is what Du Bois is talking about in double consciousness, right?
Right. Right.
The Negro is sort of a seventh son, born with a veil, and gifted with second sight. In this American world, a world would yield him no true self consciousness, but looks on him with amused contempt and pity. Right? He goes on to say, in American Negro, two souls, two warring ideals, two unreconciled strivings.
That's
which
impressive. I wouldn't even be able to remember it that way.
Bro, I'm in these texts,
For
which
sure.
strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder, right? That's
Yeah.
what I'm talking about. And Winter, like, come on now, Winter,
So you're about to get in your bag.
listen, Winter in her towards her sociogenic principles speaks so eloquently to this point, right? Like the consciousness, like we can't trust our own consciousness. Like she
Right.
literally says this in Proud Flesh. She's
Right.
like, what we have to learn is that we can't trust our own consciousness because that is the consciousness of the Western man. This is what what's my man that wrote fuck the
You
education.
remember all of that Du Bois, and you can't remember this.
Who's the dude that wrote the Negro Education, the Carter G. Woodson, right?
Okay.
This is what Carter G. Woodson was speaking of, right? And she also talks about that. But I think what's so important in how this is relating to like Caesar and Fanon and Sylvia Winter is they're talking about this consciousness that is of the colonial subject, that is not really of his consciousness because it's projected on him by the colonial power.
Right.
And when Winter relates this, right, she goes back to the lived experience of the Black Fanon, and she talks about how Fanon talks about sociogeny as opposed to ontogeny, right? And ontogeny being, the development of the organism, right? The development of the organism, which could mean the individual, right? The development of the individual, the evolutionary development of the organism and individual. But sociogeny, which Césaire is pointing to, which Fanon is pointing to, talks about the evolutionary development of society, how society develops, right?
Right.
The reason why that's important, and the reason why we can speak to it within Césaire's work, is because sociogeny is speaking to the psychosocial, right? The psychosocial, the developing consciousness of not just the first person, but the third person. So, bro, when we're talking about thingification, bro, we're literally talking about how like we're there's this thing, we're dehumanized, right? Not only are we dehumanized, but we've taken on the institutional apparatuses
Right.
of the colonial world. We've taken on the conscious. We even think of ourselves in many ways.
Yeah. We evaluate ourselves using their rubric.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The boy said, like, measuring the tape of a world, basically through the eyes of of Western man, right? So, like,
Right.
I mean, God, man, like, it's so much in that book. It's so much in there. Like, it's 25 pages, but
this is one of those things you kind of have to read maybe 2 or 3 more times.
Absolutely, bro. It's like how I feel about Walter Rodney's text, how Europe, Africa. Like, bro, you can't just read that. That's a text that you engage for the rest of your life. That's a text that you're gonna read for the rest of your life.
Right.
I feel the same way about Discourse on Colonialism, because, bro, like, it's so much in there, and it's even more interesting when you sort of like start reading what he's responding to, the movements he was around, right? I mean, he even has in the copy that I have in the back of the book, he's in conversation. He's in dialogue after that, and it's prefaced by a foreword by like Robin D.G. Kennedy,
right,
a giant intellectual, you know. And not just intellectual, but someone who's like grounded in movement work as well.
Right.
So, bro, like, I mean,
this is one of those things where it's a starter text. It's one of those texts where I've had conversations with like coworkers who, they're not African. I think one of them came from Southeast Asia, where they, didn't really believe colonialism was as bad as it was. They were like, they always make excuses for it. And, if a person who thinks colonialism wasn't that bad picks up even the first couple sentences in this book where he says Europe is indefensible, or first couple paragraphs where he says Europe is indefensible,
facts.
This is immediately going to challenge that. And I don't know where that thought is coming from, but I'm hearing it a lot with people who aren't really, they're not, in the spaces that we're in. So, they're not reading, they're not, and not in a disparaging way. It's just they, don't come across things like, so they're being, like, this is the thing, they're being fed. Of course, the Western world is going to make itself look as best as possible, right? Yeah. It was Secretary Pompeo the other day who said, this, if you believe America was founded on slavery and genocide, then you're wrong, right? And this is like a member of like government who's basically, he's trying to tell revisionist history, and a lot of people do take that to heart. And Césaire is one of those where I'm just gonna if you want to argue with me, I'm just gonna have to slide you this book.
No, for real, bro. One of the reading through this text, as someone, as a someone, in philosophy and sociology, I was reading some of the works, because he mentioned Nietzsche, right?
Yeah,
Nietzsche, and given the fact that Nietzsche is looked upon as like this, the father of postmodern thought, right?
Yeah,
and which comes with a certain form of nihilism. I would just, it's so many people that he's talking to, that he's talking about, and Nietzsche, in many respects, has been said to, take pleasure in Nazism.
Yeah.
So that so
I mean, actually, let me just read the part where he mentions Nietzsche, because
yeah, please. Oh yeah, for context, I'm sorry, man. We've been dialoguing.
no, you're good, bro. So he starts off. Therefore, comrade, you will hold as enemies, loftily, lucidly, consistently, not only sadistic governors and greedy bankers, not only prefects who torture and colonists who flog, not only corrupt check-licking politicians and subservient judges, but likewise, and for the same reason, venomous journalists, goitrous academics, wreathed in dollars and stupidity, ethnographers who go in for metaphysics, presumptuous Belgian theologians, chattering intellectuals born stinking out of the thigh of Nietzsche, the paternalists, the embracers, the corrupters, the backslappers. He's name calling as much as he can, and then he ends this thought by saying, all of them are tools of capitalism. All of them, openly or secretly, they're supporters of plundering colonialism. All of them are responsible, all hateful, all slave traders, all henceforth answerable for the violence of revolutionary action.
Bro.
That's bars.
Bro, you talking about bars?
Yeah,
bro.
What you know about that, bro?
I can't look. I don't try to compete where I don't compare. Like
yeah,
that is fucking bars, bro. Like, come on now. But he said so much in that, right? Like
this was all one sentence, by the way.
Yeah, but he's going at it. He's like, your academics, your politicians, your entertainers, they are buttressing capitalism and colonialism.
Right.
Like he's going in, and he's not just speaking about like. So if he mentions the academics, right, he's not just saying like them as people, but the thought that they prescribe to.
Right. The institutions they're functioning in.
Absolutely, right?
Right.
So we would be remiss if we did not mention the way that our modern contemporary structures within the academy work today.
Right.
Right. The way our modern contemporary entertainers work today.
Especially after COINTELPRO, it's more like it's very, very much the case.
Absolutely. I mean, what did our black entertainers do the minute that there started to be resistance on the streets?
Oh, T.I. and Killer Mike started crying on that podium, bro.
Most of these Negroes came out and admonished black people. Right.
Someone even tried to lambaste the Wendy's that burned down and said they know my order. Like, bro, that's where we at right now. That's where we're at right now.
What did the so-called intellectuals do, right? The minute, so while we have these conditions, while we have the disruption, while we have the resistance in the streets, we have those black entertainers on that bullshit. But we also have some of these academics, right, who aren't necessarily calling a spade, and who are actually aligning themselves with no other than Joe Biden.
Right.
What? Bro, this is what he's talking about.
Right.
This is what he's talking about.
Even with, you're talking about thingification. I know you saw that most recent video. It was like a bunch of like the Black Boule class who was saying, vote like your life depended on it, right? You have people's deaths who became objects like that are getting pimped out. Like people are trafficking in the deaths of black people in order for you to go vote for a rapist and a guy who locked more black men up than anybody else in history. You know what I mean? A guy who touches kids inappropriately, a guy who's not even in his right mind.
Brother.
Like they're setting us up for, they're saying Trump is the most evil thing, and they're giving us a guy who's worse than him. You know what I mean? So I'm not really strong in the area of thingification and like the subject becoming the object, but to me, this is just another like form of commodification.
Yeah.
This is how, the super PACs are going to get money out to Democrats. This is how $130 million can get laundered away. Like, Black Lives Matter got all this money. It's not doing anything for anybody. So the problem isn't necessarily the lack of funds. It's just our rulers are moral terrorists. They're just abject moral terrorists. and they're going to use your death, they're going to use your children's death to vote a rapist in. It's just the way of the Western world.
Bro, what's crazy is, I mean, none of that is hyperbole.
No.
None of it. Like, literally. I mean, none of that shit is an exaggeration. We're seeing it now. We're seeing people close ranks around, this Democratic Party. And as Cesar points out, like, all you motherfuckers are responsible.
Right.
Like, there is no, I mean, in this context, he's not, necessarily going in on, Black people in particular.
Right.
Within the upper echelons. But it's like,
I mean, they're still serving their masters pretty faithfully.
Right.
I mean, we couldn't even get, like, there was someone saying, like, rappers have, like, clauses in their contracts that forbid them from talking about the current events, to the point where, people are expected in a celebrity culture, they're given these figures to idolize, and, the world around them is burning down, and we're still looking to people who make, and granted, these rappers are in exploitive contracts. That's another issue, but these are people who are moneyed and they live lives away from us. And while we're burning, we're still asking, where is, the Black bourgeois, the Black petty bourgeois, to the point where this whole movement, it was started off with burning down buildings, and now Discover is giving out loans to Black businesses.
Yeah,
I know you've seen that advertisement.
No, really. And I mean, right after the equation of colonization equals thingification, he says, I hear the storm. They talk to me about progress, about achievements, diseases cured, improved standards of living.
Right.
I am talking about societies drained of their essence, cultures trampled underfoot, institutions undermined, lands confiscated, religions smashed, magnificent artistic creations destroy, extraordinary possibilities wiped out. But I want to go back to the first point because it's prominent within the context of the COVID-19 crisis, right?
Yeah.
I hear the storm. They talk about progress, about achievements, diseases cured, improved standards of living. What's interesting about that is if we take that on contemporary day, what COVID has exposed on a grand scale is that the United States of America is not a great nation.
Right.
It is not ahead of anybody. It is not this fucking fanatic, like, great enterprise that protects, its citizen. It's being exposed for what it is. COVID-19, we're in crisis, right? And as Amy is saying, like, I don't want to hear anything about standards of living. Think about within the context of how many evictions are going in now, right?
Yeah.
Right. But America is this great democracy, right?
Right.
Disease is cured, right?
Right.
COVID-19, but America is this great democracy, right?
Right.
Talking about people, elders dying, and not even having the systems in place to make sure that students have adequate learning in safe spaces.
Yeah.
And as capitalism mutates, you do see sort of this home sourcing where many corporations can actually save money just by having their workers not going into the office, because the office space,
it's real estate that they don't have to pay for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you see this mutation of capitalism through home sourcing.
Right.
But at the same time, citizens aren't protected.
No. The most vulnerable aren't protected.
Exactly. Right. So I mean, it is almost as if, and I mean this real, and this is not hyperbole. It's almost as if once they figured out, and I'm sure they could have known this. I mean, just think about the disparities already in the our healthcare system,
right?
The racial disparities. But as soon as it became popular narrative that African Americans were disproportionately affected by COVID, it's like the light went on. Like,
yeah,
we need to open shit back up, right?
Right.
I mean, and it's fucked up, but it speaks to the colonial question.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, this is like, it's one of those things that you always mention where you say, like, racism isn't something that can be negotiated. It's one of those things where it's actively seeking to destroy you.
Absolutely.
It's actively seeking to put you in the grave. And even with the COVID thing, it went to show that any number of it was like for a solid month, like COVID, oh, Florida's opening back up, whatever's happening, the COVID rates are through the roof. But you're seeing countries with, I guess, I don't know how good of a measure the GDP is, but countries with lower GDPs, they're not as hit hard as, like, they're not reporting the same amount of cases. And this is the entire world didn't really have illusions of America being this great space for democracy. That was more of something where I guess the internal subjects were kind of predisposed to believing that America was salvageable. A lot of the rest of the world doesn't feel that way. And this was just one of those things where it proves everybody else right. It proves what we've been saying, right? Your life is disposable. It doesn't matter that our cities are just going to be barren after all this, where all the mom and pops are, gone, and all these Jeff Bezos made what, 15, I don't even know how true that number is, but I heard 13 million, 15 million, or 15 billion in a day.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And this is something where this is going to change the order of things moving forward, at least in my opinion, because the game is different. Like, it's this indefinite lockdown where people don't know what's going to come of where their rent's going to come from. If they for sure know they're not getting rent paid, they know they have an eviction coming. They don't know about how available work is going to be. They don't know about how safe it is to put their kids in school, if their kids are going to be receiving the adequate teaching. This is one of those things where it really reinforces my understanding of Black people being the permanent underclass until they remove themselves from that position.
Yeah. And man, that's a solid point. That's a solid point. It really conjures up the question of violence. That is the logical conclusion, right?
Right.
When you think about all of the academics who have questioned the necessity of violence,
right?
That
was a topic like recently too, where people were pontificating about whether Fanon was talking about actual physical violence or like phenomenological violence, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But it's one of those things where the question of violence, and I'm not going to speak too crazy, like I'm not trying to.
Facts.
Although there's some things I'd like to say, but obviously right now is not the time for it. But the question of violence, it's something that's so plain as day. It's like one of the few things where everybody on some level understands that if you really want to be free, if you really want to make sure the future generations of your lineage, of your community, of your people, your land, wherever you're at, they know in order to obtain freedom, it's going to cost somebody's life, and hopefully it's going to cost the oppressor's life, right? Mm-hmm. This mincing of words where now academics and liberal arts programs are talking about violence in a metaphysical and abstract, where they love to say, we have to reconceptualize this, we have to reconceptualize that. People, and me personally, I'm not even really in social sciences that much, but the way I understand the verb conceptualize is to make something that exists and return it to its infancy. Like if you want to conceptualize something, you make it bare bones, as plain as it is, as very simple, and it's just a soundbite idea. But violence isn't a soundbite. Violence isn't something that can be compacted that way. It's not something where we can say there's phenomenological, and I know I'm rambling, but we can't say there's phenomenological violence and then think Fanon was talking about that, where he's saying we have to use violence to free ourselves. We're not holding positions of power in health institutions. We're not holding positions of power in the courts. We're not holding positions of power in law enforcement. Not that we want to, right?
Right.
We're not holding positions of, like, all the Black people we've elected, they've been bougie, just gutter filth. Like, people who, Lori Lightfoot was like she just let dude bring in, like, you know what I mean? Like, we knew who she was, period. But the question of violence, it's like, if people think there's no other road, they're gonna think that you can vote your way out of it. And that's why, and I don't even know. Okay, Césaire talks about, I speak about mystification, right? This mystification of violence, if that's the correct way to use the word, where they make it this ethereal thing that can just be spoken about in liberal arts college reading circles, like, it's just abhorrent. It's egregious because, and the people saying this are usually black, and black people have such a thorough history of not, I guess they associate violence with being evil and brutal, but black people have for a long history been fighting off the rulers. This idea that the black person is just naive, infantile, can't, maneuver the world or at least resist it. It's a pretty anti-black idea, and to the point where, like, I know I'm like far off where we started, but
you're good, bro. You're good.
This is one of those things where I'm just like, white people have, in effect, poisoned the way we think. And where I said we evaluate ourselves using their rubric, we're evaluating violence using a liberal bougie rubric, right?
Yeah.
Where we think we're post-colonial, where we think, the Black Power movement is over. Now we're in a new, I guess Afro-pessimism could fit in this critique, to the point where people think, it's almost this Nietzschean idea of what's the point if you're not going to vote. You know what I mean? So that's where I'm at. I'm not fucking voting, man.
Nah, me either. But yeah, I mean, that metaphysical way of constructing violence, right? Someone said that anti-colonialism is self-defense. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a fact.
Yeah. And it's like this metaphysical way of seeing violence, right? If you want to expand upon the works of Fanon, fine. If you want to take that route, fine. But if you want to say that this is what he was saying, I would disagree. But I think this metaphysical way of understanding violence is totally misunderstanding not just what racism is, but what colonialism is, right?
Right.
So Curry, like even Curry points out, like the misunderstanding of racism, which because many people see racism as like this discriminatory practice, right?
But racism, where it's just interpersonal,
right? Interpersonal in a way. I mean, and even if they think of it as structural, they think of it in a discriminatory manner in which it means that this person has something that I can't get. I can't assimilate into that. They think of it within relation to like not being able to get a job, not being able to get healthcare, not like solely that. But when you interpret racism as a genocidal logic, colonialism as a genocidal logic, you come to very different conclusions. Like even in DC, where I'm from, when we looked at the Don't Mute DC movement, it was not simply, a resistance to just it to like we can't play our music, but it was mass resistance to a cultural colonialism, right? Because by muting go-go, what you have, and you see a whole bunch of gentrification, because gentrification is one of the foundations and functions of as like a internal colonialism as well. But what you saw in that Don't Mute DC movement was a resistance to cultural colonialism, because as you have urban Black people moving out into this to the suburbs, this urban removal, you also have the removal of the customs, the traditions, and the practices that these people indigenous to those lands, these people who have lived there for so long, have brought to the city, to that urban community. So it's a disruption of that as well. So what we have to understand is like racism is genocidal culturally and is genocidal physically. It wants to rid of the colonial subjects. And when you just see it solely as, well, we need more representation on CNN, we need more representation, CEOs, we need more when you talk about representation in this sense, this privileged politics, that those who are represented are just privileged in this sense, it takes away from the meat of what racism really is, right?
Right.
Racism is taking away the capacity to reproduce in many ways, you
Right.
know? So, like, I mean, it's a genocidal logic, and genocidal logics, they go in, so many streams. But it's like people need to stop fucking like harping on these metaphysical. I mean,
Well,
it's
that's all they're taught, man. They're
yeah,
not given like they're not encouraged to do. And I'm not saying I'm the end all be all of materialist analysis. I'm still working through all of that. But these are institutions that don't promote, like frankly, I'm going to say they don't promote the communist understanding of the world. They don't promote a Marxist analysis. They don't, and I know I'm going to get some flack because they're like, well, a lot of the liberal arts postmodernists are like, Marxism isn't the only way, but Marxism has been like, if it's applied correctly, it has been it's been a one-to-one explanation of what colonialism is. If we're, reading it from Césaire and other Black Marxists who contributed to it, I've this is something I've seen speaking to people who believe these things and read these texts. They genuinely think we're in a period of post-colonialism, as in colonization has ended hard and fast in the 70s when the many nations were, or the 60s and 70s where the many nations were liberating themselves. So if you think colonialism ended, you're gonna have some ideas about, like, you're going to be an assimilationist period. Like, I think those two things, there's a direct correlation between those two things. If you're a postmodernist and you believe that colonialism ended back then, you're going to believe that racism is a matter of not assimilating enough or not being allowed in enough, to the point where now we're seeing Blacks and Latinos beefing on the timeline about representation in Hollywood.
no.
They don't see like it, and this is the thing, you're always going to have the ruling class of every colonized subject, like the bourgeois, who are going to make the crimes their people suffered, they're going to throw it out the window and make it about, well, how can we have our own talented tenant? How can we have enough representation? How can we have enough CEO jobs? That's just the nature of the game. And they become sock puppets for the ruling class anyway. I think that's their primary objective. It's to discourage the working class from actually believing the order of things can be challenged.
No, I mean, that's so real, man. Like, I mean, and you see it, you literally, like you described, like you literally start to see these conversations going on all throughout the day. I mean, just all day long.
Yeah.
But I think we can start to wrap up. But I do want to. I mean, for me, I do want to talk about like this. I spoke about like how Césaire, he, in many instances, he's responding to the interpretation of humanism of Western man, right?
Right.
And in that, he's talking about the colonial relationship, one of proletarianism, but he's also talking about how this Western conceptualization of humanism denies the colonial subjects humanity, right? It doesn't give them agency, volition, and I discussed that. But then he lays that critique down within the system of capitalism, right? Because he talks about how capitalism, in a way, the trajectory of capitalism is Nazism. Like,
right.
I'm gonna read part of that. He says, and that is the great thing I hold against pseudo-humanism, that for too long it has diminished the rights of man, that its concept of those rights has been and still is narrow and fragmentary, incomplete and biased, and of all things, sordidly racist. I have talked about a good deal about Hitler because he deserves it. He makes it possible to see the things on a large scale and to grasp the fact that capitalist society at its present stage is incapable of establishing a concept of the rights of all men, which is that rejection of humanism, just as it has proved incapable of establishing a system of individual ethics, right? And then he goes on to say, at the going down some, at the end of capitalism, which is eager to outlive its day, there is Hitler. And the end of formal humanism and philosophic renunciation, there is Hitler. So, bro,
It's every white man has a little bit of Hitler inside of him, right?
yeah, and he's talking about the concept, the concepts of rejecting the concept of humanism, but he also grounded it in the structures of capitalism, right? Because
Yeah.
earlier we talked about like the forced labor, the pressure, the police, the taxation, even in our contemporary movements, we talked about the economies that are disrupted, right?
Right.
And that's all due to due to now in the form of monopoly capitalism, which was emerging there. um but that's what capitalism becomes, because for capitalism to sustain itself, it must look to the third world and disrupt those colonial, those those cultures,
Yeah.
those systems, those political institutions. So capitalism, I mean, he's saying it right here, like, I mean, at the end of capitalism, which is eager to outlive its day, there is Hitlerism, right?
Right.
And I mean, oh my gosh, when you start to think about, because this is like 1950, right? When you start to think about what's happening about around that time, or it precedes it a little bit, when you think about like the anti-colonial struggles that started in like 1945 with like Nkrumah, and you think about how Nkrumah talks, and then later on when he writes Neo-colonialism, the highest stage of imperialism. I mean, in many respects, he doesn't mention it like this, but damn, I mean,
Yeah.
that's what capitalism is, right?
Yeah.
Um, and and lastly, I think, and I'll let you, say, say whatever you had to say. But what I think that most people have to get from this text, and most people may not know, is that when this text was written, like many people saw it as like a war document, like a declaration
Mm.
of like war. And I mean, you see documents take these approach, throughout the diaspora, right? Like
Right.
even David Walker's appeal to the color, appeal, like David Walker's appeal. I mean, that was seen as like a declaration of war in many
Right.
respects.
Right.
It was seen as galvanizing Nat Turner. But like, bro, like this document was seen as like something that didn't mince words, and that was placing a mirror up
Right.
to the European powers. And as you
Right.
mentioned earlier, the 14 European powers that includes United States, Belgium, France,
Right.
Germany, like
Sweden, Norway.
Sweden, Norway, yeah. But bro, I mean, this book is anticipating our next book, which is going to delve in to Gerald Horne's apocalypse of settler colonialism.
Right.
Uh, bro, like, because he's going in 16th century and 17th century, right?
Right.
At that time, London hadn't even emerged into the Great Britain that it will become.
Right.
Yeah, but he talked about Spaniards, Spain, Portugal, and like what was going on. Yeah, but go ahead, bro.
Yeah. This was just like, I mean, to end it up, I think I'm gonna reuse a one-liner, but where he says, the European ruling class is gonna be active in operating against these disastrous profits. I think he's speaking about himself. And, this is him prophesizing what happens at the end of capitalism.
Right.
This is him
Say that one more
prophesizing
time.
where I have it shortened in my notebook, but it goes, the European ruling class understands that the threat of those who make a historical materialist analysis they understand the threat of these people, and they are active against working against these disastrous profits.
Mhm.
So he's basically saying anybody who comes to the understanding that the European ruling class is going to eat itself, that fascism is going to be the end point. The European ruling class understands that there are people like Nkrumah, there are people like, Césaire, Fanon, that there are people who are, I guess in a biblical sense, telling the end of times. And, we're seeing that today, like people just getting abducted in the streets by like no number, like no unidentified servicemen, like American servicemen who are just picking up people from the street and getting interrogated by the FBI and possibly becoming collaborators with the FBI that way. This is like like this is, we have precedent for these kind of things in other places, but we didn't really like. For me, what I'm taking away from Césaire is he's saying the heart of empire is going to see fascism that's never been seen before. It's going to devolve into something that will precipitate, I guess, the conditions for revolution.
Yeah.
And I'm really, it's just this text is making me want to go read Gerald Horn the way you recommended, because it's one of those things where M. Césaire is saying we don't really understand what colonialism is.
Yeah.
And now it's, Stockton Malone, Gerald Horn, he's going to come in and we're going to piggyback using his work. So I'm excited for that.
Bro, I'm definitely grateful for you, bro.
Likewise.
I mean, just engaging this text with you. And I mean, this is the first of many. I do want to put that out there. Like, this is our first like conversation. This is our first like time streaming our book club. Just having like a dialogue about the book that we just read.
Yeah,
and
if there's any hiccups, like we're gonna this is something where like iron sharpens iron. We're gonna get better.
Yeah. So like I'm definitely grateful for like the space. I'm grateful for the network that we build, because I mean it includes so many others, right? I mean, because like right now, like we're in the conversation of the book club, but we'd be remiss if we didn't mention like all of the great people that we're working with to that establishing ourselves. We have Andre right here, who's like the engineer, the architect of like this I mean Q who
all good. It's all good. I'll take either or. It's all good.
Yeah. Who's like this, is architect and like this, really profound individual who does so much of the legwork. But I'm glad that we have this space, and to be honest, like I'm not mincing words when I say this, but I want this to predominantly fill up with people within the African diaspora. Like I want people to engage this in a dialectical, pedagogical way, because like I said earlier, bro, like not like I will be the first to tell you I don't have all the answers, and neither does anyone else in here. Like the shit that I was saying today, like I wasn't 100% correct on any of it, right? Like I'm not above critique, I'm not above reproach, I'm not above accountability, and this is just merely an engagement off of shit that we read, because I fundamentally believe that like you can't just engage the text, but you have to also engage other people.
Yeah, reading it by yourself you're not gonna, I mean, you're gonna get somewhere with it, but it's much more productive reading it with other people.
Yeah, I mean, really, so again, like next week, the book that we're reading, the book that we'll be going over, I think we'll be doing like the first few chapters, because that's a more extensive book. But it's Gerald Horn's Apocalypse of Cellular Colonialism. Y'all could reach out to me if y'all need like a PDF, because I'm definitely giving out PDFs like it's nothing.
And how do you want to approach Gerald Horn's book? Do you want to do it like do you want to break the book into like maybe 3, and then we read the first third of it, and then we have an episode and we read the next third? Like what are you envisioning for that with the longer books?
Though that's a longer book, it's not like extensive,
Yeah.
It's like 250 pages or something like that. But I do think, I don't have the physical copy, but I have it on my Kindle. But I think next week, because what that's really, this is a discourse on colonialism. What Gerald Horn's book gonna do is really give us like what precedes much of that, because even in like when we started, we talked about how the Berlin Conference sort of was a formal partitioning of Africa.
It was just on paper, but they've been doing it prior.
Exactly, in the third world to a much larger extent, right? So so like he's really gonna go into like how that really like starts up and stuff. So that's a really good book. But yeah, we could do about chapters and shit.
Because I mean, I'm looking at it right now. I'm looking at the table of contents, and there's 9 chapters if you exclude the introduction. So we could do 3 or 4 chapters. I would really like. I think I could hammer this out and maybe do 5. Like I could do half the book by next week.
Sorry, which book again? I missed that part.
The Apocalypse of Cellular Colonialism.
Because we wanted to stay on
okay.
colonialism, for
Yeah.
Um.
Oh, yeah, that's good. That's good. In fact, like I went through Wretched of the Earth, like fairly early on, when we were doing like literature and books in the stream. Started to go through how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but you know that's a dense read, and yeah. And I hadn't yet built the capacity to be like, hey, here's where you can go read it, etc. Here's where you can find it. Although I did give people like links to the book, but we can't really do that no more. But yeah, absolutely. If you can hit me up in the Slack chat, and I'll read the chapters myself, and I can help out next week when you come back as well.
Another thing we were thinking about.
Oh, yo, Lumpfish, did you just subscribe for 9 months in a row? What the hell? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know who that is, but I appreciate it.
Definitely. Okay, if you're watching, paying attention to the chat, because the subscriptions don't actually show up in the stream, like I was saying before.
Yeah.
But Lumpfish, who's one of our moderators, both on Twitch and in our Discord, just subscribed for 9 months.
Nice.
Yeah. Thank you. Big time. Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Another thing we were thinking about doing, because one of the things that we thought was integral with the book club was, not only like staying on subject, not just moving from because we want to stay on colonialism for like listeners and people who are reading along for a while, because much of this is going to be a dialogue with people who are listening too.
Right.
But again, this was just like the first one. So it's like, now I'm thinking like, we should have probably went into like some like questions, but again, this isn't like a teacher student thing. That's why I wasn't really harping on that. But one thing that we may have to get into is also reading select chapters out of books. Like you mentioned, like Ali, you mentioned Black Reconstruction, and that's a lengthy book. That's about 700 pages. Yep. But the first 3 chapters are extremely prominent when he goes over the worker, the white worker, and the planting class, right?
Yeah.
Because Black Reconstruction is like a Black Marxist text as well, even though he goes in on Marx, like the first 2 chapters or whatever. But yeah, like we can do that. Like we can actually do a week where we just say we're reading the first 3 chapters of Black Reconstruction. We may return to it later, but that is something we can start doing too. So,
right.
Yep. So real talk. I'm thankful for everybody who came out, engaged with us, had a conversation. Again,
I just wanted to shout out Joseph Freeman. That's a good brother right there.
Oh, what's good, Joe?
Yeah, he said, I never got to respond to it earlier, but he said they've been jumping out of vans on niggas forever. And that's true. That is very true. But we're about to get to the point where it's, I don't want to sound like apocalyptic, but
bro, fuck how it sound.
Yeah, it's about to get much worse. And a lot of white people are about to wake up and see that shit isn't sweet.
Yeah, no, for real. But
one thing, I don't know how much longer the 2 of you are going to stick around for. I just want to say that, a lot of what's discussed in that book, when you talk about like the terrific boomerang effect of, fascism coming from the colonies back into the imperial heart, watch what happens when we start experiencing scarcity this wintertime. Yeah. Like, if you're talking about like the supply chains and everything earlier on, and that's the thing that worries me the most. That's why I'm right now growing tomatoes and pumpkins and squash and beets and potatoes in my backyard.
Proactive on that fact, yeah.
Yeah. I'm just gonna like take it and carry it to my neighbors, and whoever needs, and also, donate to like the local mutual aid organization, because when people start running out this winter, it's not gonna be sweet.
Yeah. The other thing I was gonna mention was, you mentioned like sharing with your neighbor, and like, man, if you guys at all peruse like the Second Amendment segment of like YouTube and like the gun tubers and like the people who do like bug out kits where they stock their homes for food that lasts for 3 years, and they have all the ammunition in the world and they have all the guns in the world. These are people who don't, I'm just gonna say it. A lot of them are white Southerners and like white Midwesterners who really, really pride themselves on the individualism of the United States. So and this is like a whole community like abbreviated SHTF, when shit hits the fan. These people are essentially organizing themselves for when the world ends. You know, they're gonna be ready. They're not concerned about the communal efforts. I feel like Black people, if Black people take the same approach, we're more inclined to take a communal approach, where if I don't have anything, if shit hits the fan and I don't have anything, I can rely on my neighbor.
That's what we're used to that though. That's the thing.
Yeah,
Like, you know,
you know,
especially if you grew up in like primarily Black communities,
exactly.
we're so used to a communal approach inside of our own
Right.
communities that, although granted, like the community that I live in is fairly multicultural.
Yeah.
But I can think of like 5 of my neighbors off the top of my head where shit hits the fan and anybody needs anything, like we can go to each other
Got
and
each
just be like,
other.
hey, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like I can think of that right off the top of my head. And these people, like these rugged individualist types, the ones that have been like raised to think of like
I'm gonna
America
say
as
they're
like,
gonna get smoked the first day, bro.
yeah,
They
man, the people that think that America is this tyrannical force and are like doomsday preppers and all that shit, bro, first day out, they're getting waxed.
for
You know,
sure.
it's the people who are looking out for each other that are going to make it.
Yeah.
That's real. I mean, I'm so excited for. I mean, bro, when we start building, and expanding, like again, shit gonna be good. Shit gonna be good.
Let me ask: are we okay with like, let's say
I'm just saying my ass about to get robbed.
Wait, what happened?
Well, I don't know. Maybe they were referring to me, but I chose to take it that way. I found that pretty funny.
that's hilarious.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just one of those things where I've never, like, I grew up, man, with like my mom was working overtime and my neighbors would watch me. Like, we, you know, if they needed a little bit of food to run them through the week before they get paid, like we had neighbors on that level. Um, and I could see if, you know, the power goes out, the entire city, everybody's kind of have, like, there's grocery stores are being ransacked, all these things. I can see ourselves being in a better situation than the people who are, you know, collecting all this ammunition that I know for a fact they're not going to use. But yeah, as far as the book club goes, if I guess we could do like a poll, and if they're open to us having any guests who have also read the book. How do you
Yeah,
feel
I'm
about
thinking about getting Josh on the
Oh yeah,
jump.
for sure.
Oh,
For sure.
hell yes. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I was thinking about getting him on, but he was like 9:30, and you know, niggas be sleeping.
Yeah.
Oh, I will say this. For the rest of this week, not the rest of this week, but what's tomorrow? Thursday?
Yeah.
Thursday's tomorrow, yeah.
I'm good during the day. Like, and next week, like I'm good during the day, like all day before like 7, if we wanted to do anything.
Yeah, for sure. We could.
Yeah, you know what? Thursday during the daytime and Friday, as long as it's before 2 p.m. or sorry, as long as it's before 1 p.m. or after 4, I'm good. Because when the girls are down for a nap, that's when I gotta have some, like, you know, alone time with wifey. But aside from that, yeah, like when they're down for a nap, we'll just like sit down and like watch a movie or something and just chill out. So that's our time. But aside from that, like I'm good.
Nah, that's
Yeah,
good.
y'all got kids and shit, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, bro.
It's workarounds. All right. By the way, chat, who should we rate into right now? Who would be a good person? And by the way, I noticed that we have 181 viewers, which is like much higher than we normally would have. Did we get rated or?
I never
I didn't-
saw that, but I wasn't keeping tabs on the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't see if we got rated by somebody or not, but that's normally quite a bit higher than we normally have. Yeah. We're at over 180 right now.
Oh,
Man,
that's
these
good.
terms are so different. Twitch is still something that, like, it's super hard to get my head around.
Oh, Central Committee rated. Okay, got it. I was like, what prompted that?
Was that
All right,
recent?
well, yeah. That's so my Central Committee is another one of the Twitch channels. That's my boy Mike, and he talks like political discourse. So big up to Mike. I'm gonna hit him up on Discord right after this.
Yeah,
So who should
big
we
ups
rate
to
into
you,
next? Yeah, I think I'm gonna drop everybody off into SBTV_, and y'all can talk economic theory. Oh wait, yeah, economic theory and so forth, or Canadian popular stuff. Which one do you prefer? Chat, like we'll take a vote on this one. Would you want to go to SBTV_, or would you want to go to Canadian populist left?
I don't
I'm just
even
gonna.
know.
It's like other people that are like friendly with this channel and so
I
forth.
got you.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go ahead and rate SBTV underscore. So everybody, thank you for dropping by tonight. We really appreciate it. And I guess we'll see you again next week, Wednesday.
Peace.
All right, y'all. Peace.
Love.